Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Sitting at the bottom of the tower that houses the offices of Los Angeles Magazine, which means we're not far from Johnie's coffee shop on Wilshire Boulevard. For those who don't know Johnie's or who listen and they're not in Los Angeles, what is Johnie's?
Johnie's is a space-age 50s modern coffee shop that has a roof shaped like a butterfly that sort of electrifies the corner of Wilshire and Fairfax.
What else can you tell us about it? Tell us one thing about it that matters to you.
Well, it's just a very significant moment in mid-century architecture in LA. It's a great moment of commercial, modern. It's a fantastic sculptural creation by Armand Davis, who were some of the architects that created these awesome roadside treasures that are kind of very few and far between these days.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down here in the area, I suppose I'll call it mid-Wilshire, with Chris Nichols. He's an associate editor at Los Angeles Magazine, author of the popular Ask Chris blog and section, and column you would call it, I suppose, and the author of the book The Leisure Architecture of Wayne McAllister. Also, he's known as a civic booster. Tell me, Chris, what does it mean to be a civic booster in your mind?
It means seeing the good things where everybody else sees the bad things. I don't know. It's very, my glass is half full, and I just love directing people to the special things that really make Los Angeles come alive, and the stuff that's kind of hidden behind fences and foliage and remodeling and changes and things that are really kind of hiding in plain sight. I really love to be able to direct people to down an alley, around a corner, in a lobby, and to find some special hidden thing. There's so many wondrous things here that are invisible. I talk about it being like raisins in oatmeal. There's so much oatmeal, and the raisins are really, really good if you can find them.
Is that task different in a basic way, being a civic booster in Los Angeles, from being a civic booster in New York or Chicago or Poughkeepsie or Muskogee or wherever? I mean, is the job of civic booster different here because of what Los Angeles is?
Well, there's certainly a lot more distraction here than in other towns, but I think that one of the things about Los Angeles is that all the great things are not all the great things, but many of the great things are hidden. They're private space, or they're sort of, forgotten things, or, whereas in other cities, you go, you get off the plane, you come up out of the train, and voila, there you are. You're in the middle of something great. And here, what tourist finds their way to Watts? You really have to be, you really have to be encouraged, and you really have to be determined to find a magical thing in a far-flung locale.
Is it just because the city is so big? Is it because you're going around 500 square miles to find cool things, and there's cool things dotted across those 500 square miles?
Well, it's that, and then I think that it's also that a lot of folks sort of have become very, neighborhood-centric. I know people that won't go east of a street, or won't go west of a street, or won't ever go to
La Brea, La Cienega, the 10.
I mean, how many times do you talk someone into going to lunch in San Pedro, or it's so far-flung, and yet it's so difficult to sort of work your way through it, at 2 a.m, when you're on the freeway and it's flowing and it's perfect and great and silent and everything's illuminated, it's really, you kind of feel that promise of what they were looking for, 50, 60 years ago, when they imagined this car culture, and it's great, and I love nothing more than to sort of, take some folks, in a very, very quick journey, a very smooth and easy trip, and end up at some, magical place where there's a flashing neon sign, or there's some slick surfaces and things reflecting, and maybe it's overgrown, and, and you can kind of go in and find some wondrous thing that's sort of hiding in plain sight.
And that idea of the space-age post-war car culture in America that you see remnants of in Los Angeles, I mean, is it too much for me to say that the idea of that car culture didn't really pan out, but but the remnants are fascinating enough that it sort of makes something different than was envisioned, but something still fascinating?
Well, I don't think that, we really did get to an age of jetpacks and flying cars, but it lasted for a really long time, and it's still alive, in certain places. And I mean, there are, people trying to catch your eye with a flashy building, or people trying to draw you in with easy parking, or, a lot of the same elements that made those places successful live on in different weird mutations in this century. And I think that when you find an original one, it works really well. I oftentimes want to find a place where I can pull in, have easy parking, have a comfortable place to sit and read the paper for an hour for, price of a drink or something, And that's become such a rare thing, And when you drive around and you can't really live the car culture and you have to kind of keep going, it puts you in a different mood and it makes you kind of uncomfortable, and you do just park the car and get out and walk. And that's a whole different mode, and that's wonderful. And I do it all the time in downtown and in Hollywood and places where you can walk around. But I do kind of, yearn for that easy breezy livin that all those great architectural renderings of the 50s, sort of made it seem like we were going to be enjoying in the next century.
What were the first raisins you discovered in this Los Angeles oatmeal that made you suspect there were a lot more raisins to be found?
Well, I guess the real obvious things, flashing neon signs, cartoonish architecture that I noticed when I was a kid driving around. And then when Alan Hess wrote Googie in the 80s, and I got that as a birthday present, it totally changed my life. And I made my parents drive around and show me these places. I wanted to see ships. I wanted to see Panns. I wanted to see norms. And they seemed like some lost, Valley of the Giants that I needed to go to. And I didn't realize they were all, miles apart and in completely different surroundings. And I thought they all just lived in some oasis in the desert somewhere.
You've mentioned Googie architecture. This is something that some listeners will know, but they won't all. What is Googie?
Well, Los Angeles did it better than any place else. I'm sorry, they did. We did. We really owned it. I mean, just the quality of these places and the people that were doing them were so talented here. Googie architecture, is space age architecture. It's modern architecture, but it's extreme. It's science fiction extreme in a car culture setting. So you've got some jutting prow that's hanging over the road, and you dip in and you go through some lush foliage and under a flashing sign, and you pull under some sheltering canopy, and the whole thing is sort of like a glass jewel box that you can look into and see activity and fun and motion, and it's sort of it's a theatrical experience, pulling up to one of these places, and they're electrifying and alive, and they're just so cool. I just love them so much.
In your book on Wayne McAllister, The Leisure Architecture of Wayne McAllister, he seems to me to be a pillar of Googie, is he not?
He was sort of pre-Googie. I mean, Wayne was working in the 1920s. He designed a resort hotel casino in Mexico because you couldn't drink or gamble or race horses here. And that was a Spanish, Moorish, Islamic, deco fantasy. And then he went on to do streamlined modern stuff, and then he went on to do sort of late modern stuff, and then by the mid-50s he was kind of out of architecture. He became a vice president at Marriott Corporation and moved to DC, and so by the peak of Googie he was kind of out of the picture. He was doing this proto-Googie stuff like the Bob's Big Boy in Burbank, sort of late modern, lots of glass and curves and neon and kind of hidden neon and things that glowed and just beautiful sculptural stuff. And he sort of invented that circular drive-in restaurant in LA, and sort of streamlined and cleaned up all the earlier versions of drive-in restaurants to make them machines for living in your car. And then he would go on to invent Las Vegas. I mean, and his greatest creations there, the Sands and the Fremont, were, sort of proto-Googie. They were just 5 minutes before, and they're great. They're more like modern, sort of simplified things. And his first project in Vegas, the thing that really set the framework for the whole city, was the El Rancho Vegas, which was a very sort of traditional Western ranch structure that wasn't modern at all. So he was able to slip in and out of modern where other people sort of lived it as a, philosophy, and he sort of was just doing what worked for the site and for the client and for the lifestyle they were trying to create.
And what ended Googie? Why did that come to an end? Is it the same thing that ends all architectural movements?
I don't know. I feel like the people that practiced it were almost embarrassed of their exuberance, and the people that wanted it felt the same way. They sort of became much more sober in the mid-'60s, and they sort of apologized for this stuff. McDonald's took this great extreme of chopping off all the arches of their restaurants and putting these false mansard roofs on top of them, covering shiny tile, red and white tile with used brick, and so just toning down everything. And other people would put awnings over wavy roof lines. They would grow plants so big that they would obscure the building. I don't know where that came from. I'm not of the generation that felt that, and I don't know why they were so sort of shy about something that they had created, and retracted from it.
Do you think Los Angeles has grown ashamed of its exuberance to some extent, just in general?
I think we're over it. And I think that we're back to wanting to be, a little bit flashy again. I think it kind of started with, maybe with Disney Hall, and doing things that are sort of, and I think that the revival of Palm Springs in the 2000s really led to people appreciating modern roadside and appreciating the sleekness and the lines of it, to the point where now, modernism has become a historical style that's reinterpreted in fashion and in design and in graphic design, and like almost to the point where it's, kind of maybe not helping the originals.
What do you mean by not helping the originals?
Well, I think that running the risk of being a fad might make it turn in the future where people don't appreciate the thing that inspired it, where maybe they, get turned off thinking it's not as authentic a thing as it is, or I don't know. It just makes me nervous that it became so fatty in the last, few years. I don't know what these sort of conventions and the big Palm Springs modernism show that draws thousands and thousands of people, and it just being in every fashion spread for a decade or more now just makes me nervous.
It does seem like modernism could be something enduring at the base of Los Angeles almost, and you see it get suddenly so popular, and you think, wait, maybe this has been turned into a flash in the pan somehow. That these aesthetic principles are sound, but now it's becoming trendy.
And that's what kind of worries me. And I hope that it becomes, a great sort of, lifestyle that we all appreciate, but it could have negative repercussions.
Now, I mentioned earlier your column in Los Angeles Magazine, Ask Chris, and of course you do a blog of the same name. How did Ask Chris come into existence?
People asked Chris. My editors,
just giving the people what they want, right?
My editors, always brought me in to kind of come up with new and interesting angles on places in the city and to find hidden things, and they sort of came up with this idea of turning it into a column, and I love it, and it's fantastic to do it, and I appreciate that so many people out there are so curious about the city, and that I have the opportunity to dig deep, to drill down and figure these things out, and it's kind of great. And I get so many weird letters from people all the time, about very, very local neighborhood specific things, about how things work. And I get a lot of like, what's that crazy thing I drove by?
Yes, very common.
Yeah. So, the fact that I can sort of maybe even help people with things, is fantastic, to explain how you can fix something that's broken, explain how you can get people to get the city to do things for you, is rewarding.
There are so many of those questions. What's up with those drawings of the Peanuts characters I see on this bridge, or what's up with this building that seems uninhabited, but it's been standing there for 50 years, or didn't this used to exist there? What function could this possibly serve? Los Angeles seems well stocked with those kinds of public items, you might say, or publicly seen items. Some of them, though, there are some things here that I feel I almost don't want explained. I mean, that metallic head of Lenin with the balancer on top on La Brea and Fourth. I mean, is that something that should be explained or something that should not be explained?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how that ended up on the corner, and I am curious. But, certainly with art, who wants to explain their art? Who wants to explain their joke? Who wants to explain their, I get that from artists when I try to figure out, why are you doing this, And that's something that anybody that writes about that would come into. But I do think that if I can bring attention to something that can be helped by it, like what's that abandoned barrel in North Hollywood, and now there's a great save happening there. That abandoned barrel is being restored and becoming what it was originally, a restaurant and bar. And I love playing a part in something like that. That means the world to me.
Now that I'm thinking about La Brea Avenue, where the head is, where the Lenin head is, and also a street very commonly cited as one somebody won't go east or west of, a great divider. But it's also a street where there's many neat things like the head, but shops and all kinds of fun things if you look for them on La Brea. But also the street itself feels somehow inhospitable in a very basic way. I don't know if you felt that as well there. It feels like it's maybe the scale is off, or that it's desolate even when it's not desolate. It seems like it's a representation of some of the complaints people have about Los Angeles and the joys of Los Angeles. Is that too much to say about a street like La Brea, or have you felt this?
Well, it's in the middle of major change. La Brea is like ground zero for these dense apartment projects right now, and I'm not defending that Carl Jr. that was on Santa Monica and La Brea, but I mean, when something like a very low-grade car culture thing goes away, where you have easy breezy parking, you go in and do your business there, and it is replaced by a dense to the sidewalk, giant sun-blocking apartment building, the whole neighborhood has changed, and the whole part of the city has changed, and that happens over and over and over again, sort of slowly, and you don't realize that there's been a wall of, or there's about to be a wall of humanity there that didn't exist before. La Brea has great history going back to Charlie Chaplin, and his studio there. But I mean, like, two of my favorite things are at La Brea and Sunset. The Tiny Nailers restaurant, space age jet wing building that came down in 1984. Started the LA Conservancy Modern Committee, which I've been involved with for many years. And Art LeBeau broadcasts his oldies radio show from above a gas station in Sunset La Brea. Those are two cornerstones of me.
Conservancy. What do you really want to preserve? What would you go down preserving here in Los Angeles?
The thing we always talk about is last, best. First, last, best. First, last, best. And so I think that when you have something where a whole species of something has been decimated, like say drive-in theaters, for example, we worked really hard to save a drive-in theater on Route 66, a very intact 50-year-old resource. We sort of won, and then we sort of lost, and most of it's gone now. But, when you're down to one or two or three of something, examples that may have been lesser at the peak of its existence suddenly take on new meaning. With the, Googie coffee shops, which are my specialty, you've got Pann's, you've got Norm's, you've got Johnnie's at Wilshire and Fairfax here, and they're among the survivors that retain a high degree of integrity, whereas you've got other ones floating around out there that are not so great. So, you go down for one and you lose another. But I think that at this point, we're getting so far from this stuff, that the good examples are really, really, really worth putting all your effort into.
Are Pann's and Norm's the cornerstones of the modern coffee shops you can actually eat and drink at, or are there more, or are those two the sort of top of the heap?
Well, I mean, Pann's especially is just unbelievable because not only is it completely intact from day one, not only is it a high style design from Armand Davis, the people that invented the style, but it still has the original owner. The woman that opened the door in 1958 is still seating people in 2012. And it's amazing to go in there and have the experience that, your grandparents had. And like, it's really that same lady, and it's the same food, and it's the same place. Not only are you living in the architectural moment, but you're living in the cultural moment. It's exactly like it was, 50 years ago. And how often does that happen? I mean, even at a place like Musso and Frank, there's nobody that's been there for 50 years. Being able to have the full-on experience at a place like Pann's, for example, makes it incredibly unique and incredibly valuable and special. And I think that with regard to Googie coffee shops, if they have the pedigree of being designed by these extraordinary architects, Armand Davis, New Love, that they achieve something, higher than some of the sort of lesser designers. But no, sure, there's there are a good number of examples. There's at least 20 places that are definitely worth visiting. If you're looking for architecture, if you're looking for food, maybe not. If you're looking for a full-on immersive experience, just a tiny handful.
Last time on the show, we had Frances Anderton on, who hosts Design and Architecture on KCRW, and she talked about a fear she has that the freedom that allowed so much eccentric and exuberant architecture in Los Angeles is valuable, and there may come a day when there's when preservation goes one step too far and stops future exuberance and eccentricity. Is that a fear you have? Is there a point where preservation might go too far? It sounds like there's still battles to be fought to have enough preservation, but is there a point where we might become too preserved?
I admire Frances, and I think that she does great things, but I completely disagree with her on this issue. Uh-huh. There are more than 900,000 parcels in LA, and there are barely 1,000 of them that are landmarked.
I guess for listeners who don't know, a parcel is what?
A parcel is a piece of land. Is a piece of land owned by one, with one address basically. So there are almost 1 million addresses in LA, and only 1,000 are landmarked in any way. And when something is landmarked, in LA at least, the only time that you have to seek approval is when you want to do major changes to it. And so, yeah, if you wanted to add a new innovative piece of architecture to a landmarked building, that would require approval. And yes, that may possibly, have an influence on that. But a far, far bigger influence would be just regular old zoning and regular old codes that LA has that keep you from doing things like this. I mean, in Wayne McAllister's day, he didn't put doors on his drive-ins or windows. Mm-hmm. They were completely open air, and they were open 24 hours. And maybe they didn't have, maybe the bathrooms were, 50 square feet or something. They weren't, it's code, it's economic conditions where you can't, afford to put half your budget into your sign because you have to put that money into doing more pragmatic things. It's certainly, in my experience, not been preservation. I've never seen something proposed that is more creative than what it's replacing.
It's always a step down in terms of interestingness.
Well, I mean, yeah, and I feel funny saying that, but that everything that I've come across, replacing a one-off architect-designed, spectacular creation with a, chain Lubin tune is not progress, or I mean, that's the kind of thing that we hear about and we see, and it just drives me crazy. There was a spectacular Armand Davis building in Hawthorne that was used in the movie Pulp Fiction, and that was demoed for a cinder block auto parts store, a cube. I mean, it's certainly not creative or innovative or pushing any boundary in any direction. It's not. It's nothing to be admired.
Tell me what knowing the history of Los Angeles, always learning more about the history of Los Angeles, gives you when you're simply walking around the city, driving around it, experiencing it in a day-to-day way. How does knowing about the past even though it only goes back so far, I suppose, and Europeans sometimes make fun of Los Angeles for that reason. How does knowing more about the past change the way you experience the city every day?
Sometimes I have this strange sort of, Rain Man thing where I kind of like pile on the layers. I make these sort of archaeological maps of things, of how things are laid out, and I understand, well, of course there's a little neighborhood counter restaurant here because at some point it was a Woolworth counter or something, and before that it was I sort of see why things are where they are. I see, oh, well, there used to be 3 tiny parcels here, and that got combined into one big shopping center. I know that there used to be, this and that, and that's what, so I see it sort of maybe in a more holistic way because I understand why, and I can make excuses for things, like, oh, well, of course, it had to be here because it replaced such and such.
Right.
And so knowing that is great in a way because I can go back, 100, 200 years and explain why things are the way they are occasionally. But, on the other side, people come in and see this mess, and I have to spend all this time explaining to them why it got this way, and they don't care, and they don't want to see this mess. They want to see it. They want to see it done right.
So when someone comes to Los Angeles, it often happens. They'll say, "Nothing here makes sense. Everything is random. There's no rhyme or reason to Los Angeles. There's just no reasons here." You can say, "Well, there's exactly a reason for everything. I can tell you what it is if you want to listen."
But it's invisible, and people think with their eyes, and they want to be able to go. I met these tourists on the street the other day, and they wanted to go shopping in downtown, and they wanted to know where the high-rises were so they could go shopping there. And I had to explain, well, no, the high-rises are, financial towers. They're not going to let you in. There's no shopping mall there. There's no shopping district there because the shopping district was on the east side of downtown. And, and sort of I didn't have time to explain to them the Bunker Hill redevelopment, of the last 50 years. But
language barrier as well, probably.
Yeah. I mean, I it's a burden sometimes to know these things and not be able to just sort of blow it off to how awful this is or how awful this neighborhood is. I can explain both sides of it and argue it in my head, and it's challenging.
Now, tell me about the tourist experience, the experience guiding tourists or helping them. I've had this challenge as well. Of course, I don't have the knowledge you do, so I've had an even more difficult time, and I give less fruitful answers to questions from people who want to find, where's the commercial center downtown? That's a question I've gotten a few times. Tell me, what is most important for somebody who is visiting from Europe or Asia or even from the East Coast of North America to understand when they come to Los Angeles, when they want to have an illuminating time here, I guess you might say?
When I give a private tour, I try to interview the person and sort of get an idea of what excites them and what motivates them and what they really want to experience, what sort of fantasy they have about Los Angeles. So someone that wanted an Art Deco experience, I made arrangements to get them into the most spectacular Art Deco interiors we have. And we took the train between them, and it was quick and it was easy, and it seemed like they were all lined up on the block. And I think that when you have somebody that sees, a great glass cliffhanger hillside house and imagines having a drink there at sunset, and overlooking the city, you take them to the Stall House. You take them on a tour there. You take them someplace that lives out these fantasies that they have. You can go to the Wax Museum, I suppose, and see the celebrities, or you can go to the Ivy, and hang out, and somebody will pop up there. So
sooner or later.
Yeah. So I think that figuring out what it is that they want Los Angeles to be and showing them where that is a talent that I have. And I think that people, that just show up someplace and expect it to be obvious or expect it to come to them are going to be disappointed.
The fantasies of Los Angeles. I mean, how wide a range of fantasies do people have about Los Angeles? What are they fantasizing about besides the drink outside on the deck of the mid-century modern home, overlooking the rest of the city?
I hear so many different expectations, and I guess they come from movies. Do they come from magazine stories? Like the ones that we put out in Los Angeles Magazine? Do they expect to be in the middle of an LAPD bust? Do they expect to be on a movie set? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it comes from a wide variety of sources, but all those things are true, and you can live all those experiences, and you can live all those lifestyles and all those moments and all those great and horrible things if you just point yourself in the right direction. And I think that, the magazine does a tremendous job of bringing all those things to life. And I think that if you know what you're looking for and take the time to find it, you can have it here. I mean, there are 88 cities in Los Angeles and in Los Angeles County. I think that if you just show up someplace, it's not going to come to you. Mm. You have to go looking for it.
Why is it so non-forthcoming here? Why doesn't anything come to you in Los Angeles? It's you can learn how to deal with it, but why does that happen?
It's just simple geography. Mm. It's just so ridiculously large and sprawling. You can literally drive for an hour in any direction and it does not end. Mm. I go down Route 66. I go east, and it's like those looping backgrounds in the Hanna-Barbera cartoons, that just keep repeating and repeating. and I think that if you don't know where you're going, you're not going to find it. And so you could live your entire life in one corner of the city, and people increasingly are doing that. Mm. There are people that don't leave downtown. There are people that don't leave Santa Monica. Right. And you could have everything you want in that area. You can have your workplace, you can have your restaurants, you can have your entertainment, you can have your nature, your family, but you would never know of the wonders of Cucamonga. Mm. You would never know of some great secret thing that's hidden down at, near Dockweiler Beach or something. And I think that if you live your life in a bubble, the bubble gets smaller and smaller, and you need to get out of it.
What would be a wonder of Cucamonga, by the way? It can be just one.
Roadside stuff. There's like little ruins out there of Route 66 stuff. I'd probably go a little bit further and go to the Wigwam Village in the next town over. A roadside motel complex with 16 wigwams, little cones that you can spend the night in. I had a party there where a couple years ago where I took over the whole place and did a show out on the grass between the teepees.
Now I've heard word of your parties. It sounds like you have found Los Angeles a suitable city indeed to conduct parties in. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, and I exploit it as much as I possibly can. But I mean, there's a reason that the film industry, loves it here, because you can have anything you want within a few minutes. You can have a mountain or a desert or a New England village or a, urban rundown neighborhood or anything. It's all here and in multiples, and so this year I did have a party at a New England village, and I've had a party on a streamlined train, and I've had a party at a plantation house on a hill. And so all these incredible environments are just waiting to be discovered.
You've thrown parties all over Los Angeles then, exploiting all you can, all the variety we really do have here. I mean, tell me a rule for throwing Los Angeles parties that we might not expect.
I think the secret is to show off corners that don't get much love and don't get a lot of respect. And don't get a lot of attention, and don't necessarily take your guests to Santa Monica Pier. Take them to the sort of rundown amusement park at Balboa Island, which I did a couple years ago, and then turn that into a Scooby-Doo mystery.
Oh, sure.
So I think that sort of taking something that's neglected and shining a light on it, and then giving it a full-on backstory and character and attention transforms it in people's eyes. When you take them to see something beautiful that's damaged or that's decayed or that's not in its pristine setting, and then you can, verbally at least, explain all the nonsense away and show the beauty of the thing that's waiting to be discovered, then people's opinions about it change. So imagine this, But imagine that little ratty store not being there. Imagine the tube socks not being here. And then look up and see what's above it. And then imagine that next door was, a glamorous salon and a theater and a this and a that. And then, and then look down at the terrazzo and see the terrazzo spells out the name of the original tenant and see it was this and it was this. And I mean, not just loosely explaining, oh, this used to be a great thing, but pointing out the details and knocking on walls and showing things that are still there and that are still beautiful and that are misused or misplaced or misunderstood by later people. There's this great Dutch chocolate shop in downtown from 1914 maybe, an entire sort of huge restaurant space full of this brown Batchelder tile, from the arts and crafts movement, sculptured sort of groins, and this sort of figures of Dutch children, blowing bubbles. This total fantasy environment, which for the last 30 years has been an indoor swap meet and has been completely stuffed with hats and posters on the walls and plywood dividers and was invisible to anybody that didn't look straight up, and didn't look beyond the glare of the fluorescent lights and didn't look straight through them and see this. And now it's been cleaned up and it's heading for a good future. I went into a computer store in Pasadena, and I said to the clerk, I know there was a theater here at one time. Is there any remnant of that? Have you ever seen any kind of element of the theater? Is there any kind, like if you poked up through the ceiling, would there be anything there? No, nothing at all. I said, well, I know it was here. He said, no, this was never a theater. And I said, well, I'm pretty sure. And he said, nope, nothing. And I was about to walk out when he said, well, there is the storeroom. And I said, oh, well, do you think I could see that? And I went behind the counter, and there was a spectacular 1920s movie palace that had this, that had boxes of computers stacked in it down the ramps where the seats had been.
There's just our spectacular movie palace, yes.
Yeah, the storeroom? Nah. And behind this drywall, mask, there was this wonder.
It's this idea that people hadn't looked up. I mean, I've only been an Angelino for 1 year. You've been here much longer. But there's that Angelino complacency that can fall upon us. I think you it won't. You're Chris Nichols. You're a public figure known for exploring, for always finding out more. But I meet a lot of people, and the natives are the worst about it, who tend to just go completely blind to the surroundings. Does this happen everywhere? Is this a Los Angeles thing? How do we keep from going blind to this city?
I think it happens everywhere, and I think that it's a function of just seeing in one dimension, of just seeing the current time and exactly where you're at. And by not understanding the rich layers of everything, and by not caring about that and not paying attention, then an indoor swap meet is an indoor swap meet. Mm-hmm. It's not a movie palace, or it's not some reminder of what it was. And it's seeing architecture as in a basic way. You go, like, for example, you go into that place, it's an indoor swap meet. It's not a 100-year-old Dutch chocolate shop. And so now that the indoor swap meet is gone, it's a Dutch chocolate shop again. And I think that it takes seeing things in multiple dimensions of, use, land use, and time, and sort of seeing through the hurricane of time, seeing what survives through that, what elements are still here and are still intact. And I don't know, I guess it's kind of hard. Bring your own chocolate and suddenly it's a chocolate shop again.
How far does your personal history with Los Angeles stretch? You mentioned asking to be taken to all the Googie diners when you received the book, but how far back do you go with this place?
I was born in the San Gabriel Valley. My parents both came here in the 1950s. Their parents, my mom's side, went to Miami and went to Los Angeles, and they were trying to choose a new base from Ohio, and they had a better time in Los Angeles. And I saw their pictures of the trip, and they went to Disneyland, and they went to a McAllister designed coffee shop, and they went and they did all kinds of fun things that I still do today. They really lived that suburban, mid-century lifestyle of the, new house and what had been orange groves and drive-in movies and drive-in restaurants and coffee shops and just all those great things that I missed out on, in their initial incarnation. Because I first experienced this stuff at the bottom of its popularity. I was seeing it in the 80s when I was a kid, and it was kind of a lot of these places were heading for the finish line. And I've been to plenty of closing night parties and wakes and even more demolition days. And, I've tried to do my share of salvage from places, and it's horrifying, when you get to know a place and you love it and you see it coming to the end and you see the closing night and then you see it go away. It's like watching a friend slowly, die, and it's heartbreaking. And, I kind of do it to support the place and to be there for it and to see it off, when it leaves.
The 80s seemed to me, from the stories I hear, unless you were a punk rocker, kind of a nadir for Los Angeles in general, whether we're talking crime or smog or destruction. Is that true?
Well, I certainly was told to roll my window up and keep the car door locked when we drove through Hollywood when I was a kid. When I went to the closing night thing, the last night at Tiny Nailers, yeah, sure, there were teenage prostitutes all over the Hollywood Boulevard. It was runaways, and it was, a scary kind of place. I don't know, if I was an adult, maybe I would have had a different point of view. And if I was me, maybe I would have seen through all of that and thought it was just, peaches and cream.
There's this memorable phrase Richard Meltzer had about Los Angeles, the music critic. He described it, the world moving in after the 1984 Olympics. After that point, the city seemed to become very strongly international. I live in Koreatown, a neighborhood that didn't exist when the Googie architecture was riding high. Couldn't have been envisioned. Koreatown. Yeah, then there's so many more you can name. Now, the city has become as those signs that Via Ragosa used to put up said, a world in itself. What has that given or taken from Los Angeles to your mind? The fact that we're now a microcosm of the globe as well as being partially this mid-century dream city.
I think it just completely fleshed it out. I think that the great bones of stuff that came before it, laid this great groundwork for architecture and for great sort of monuments, all the great stuff of the 20s and 30s that's here. But then all the sort of little things, all the sort of neighborhoods have, in many ways been enhanced by these tremendous things. But then, like example, in Koreatown, it's been completely transformed, and yet much of the architecture of the previous generations exists. Mm-hmm. So, I love the intense futurist, over-the-top stuff in Koreatown, and I think that's kind of a natural outgrowth of the stuff that I love from mid-century. And I love that there's a light show and that there's, something going on in a bar and that it's just this really flashy thing. But yet there's also this strange sort of layering when you have a place like the Brown Derby that's now kind of a bottle service, a Koreatown bar that doesn't seem to play by all the rules,
The rules don't apply the same way in Koreatown, I've noticed.
Yeah, it seems like it. I mean, the wet napkin phenomena, the where you
might be worth explaining, yeah.
Where you can't smoke in bars, and yet certain bars in Koreatown happen to have a supply of wet napkins that are an invitation to smoke. Just weird things like that.
Some of them are technically outdoors because they have a thin strip of, maybe you know about this more than I do, but you can build a bar that seems, for all intents and purposes, indoors, but technically it is outdoors because of some thin strip of openness along the top of the wall, something like that.
If you're clever enough to avoid the code in that way, you're doing a lot better than most people that just completely flaunt things like that. Yeah, I mean, and it's a funny thing. One of my favorite places to take people is the Prince restaurant, yes. The old Windsor in Koreatown, which not only is a thriving Korean restaurant, but it's in the shell of this great mid-century Old English sort of theme room that still has all of its original awards on the wall from the, Chateaubriand of the year 1965, and yet it's this very contemporary, like, Koreatown environment, this bar and pulsing music and stuff in the shadow of this room that used to sort of house this sort of old money Los Angeles power structure that long ago abandoned it.
It's true. I live about 3 blocks from the Prince. I know well what you mean. And I was going to ask you if there's anything new you like in Los Angeles that fascinates you, but that may be a partial answer. The repurposing of old things. I mean, is that what is interestingly new in Los Angeles, the way we're using the old? Or are there any whole cloth new anythings in Los Angeles, buildings, neighborhoods, or otherwise, that you look at and say, that's as fascinating as the Googie diners, as the repurposed Koreatown bars, as the drive-in theaters?
There's very few places that try as hard as my favorite architects, did. There was an architect in Los Angeles named Stephen Canner who passed away a couple years ago, but was a young architect doing sort of the natural progression of Googie stuff, doing 21st century futurism. And I like the work he did, and I love the energy of Koreatown bars. It feels very ephemeral in that most of it is light shows, or most of it is sort of literally plastic and things that don't feel very permanent. And I love places that try. There's a guy who single-handedly built a Titanic replica on Western Avenue.
Cafe Jack, I know it.
Cafe Jack is awesome.
It is.
And
that's one of those places you can secretly smoke into.
Yeah, and that goes back to the roadside tradition of building, a teepee, or building a giant hot dog, or building a brown derby on the side of the road. And God bless that guy. He really, put his heart and soul into it. I watched him build that thing, and it was amazing that could even meet code. that he did that he could build a ship in water on a main boulevard like that. And so when anyone goes the extra mile and really tries to make something that catches my eye, I certainly pay them back with stopping in and buying a hamburger.
You go a little farther north on Western Avenue and you see a Kentucky Fried Chicken that was built in about 1990 that is shaped conceptually like a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, but it also seems so strikingly, I don't know if it was part of the postmodern era of architecture, but it looks like it wasn't supposed to be a KFC, and then it seems like it was very much supposed to be one. But you know the building I'm talking about.
Sure.
It was supposedly designed by a protege of Frank Gehry of the Disney Concert Hall fame. I mean, what's this? It seems like a Los Angeles landmark to me, this KFC now, as it represents something. Is it actually important, or am I just enthusing over something at a novelty?
It's important for its moment. There are certain historical periods in architecture that are underrepresented, and maybe that's it. Maybe it's late 80s commercial futurism is pretty rare here.
Have you had to ask Chris about that building, by the way? That's about time, I think. What do you know about it? I need to know about this KFC.
Are you submitting a question to my column?
Yeah, Chris, what is the story with that Kentucky Fried Chicken on Western and Beverly? It seems I hear it was designed by a protege of Frank Gehry. Why?
I looked up the architect once and I did not recognize their name. Sorry if you're listening. But it was somebody that hadn't done a lot of work that caught my eye. But that building certainly catches your eye. I mean, it's so abstract that, and I've heard it referred to as a chicken, as looking like a chicken, and a bucket, and and a number of things.
It's kind of a Rorschach blot, ultimately.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's so abstract that it just looks like, some postmodern collage of building materials, but and it doesn't look like a giant chicken, which they would have done on that same corner 60 or 70 years before that. And it's interesting and it's quirky, but it doesn't really draw me in as much as something that seems to pour its heart out. Right. Like a Googie coffee shop, or like a roadside giant, or like some like those Koreatown bars that really just go insane trying to get your attention.
We mentioned this, that this guy who did the KFC was a protege of Gehry, but Frank Gehry's actual Disney concert hall, it was regarded as being representative of so much, meaning so much, so important to Los Angeles. This means a new Los Angeles. This means downtown revived. This means culture is important once again in Los Angeles. This means. What does it mean, if anything, to you?
I think that what it means is that it gets rich people paying attention to downtown. It gets powerful people paying attention to downtown, and that's a good thing. But the real rebirth of downtown had so much more to do with small, tiny, little developers, little business owners, little, and a lot of little. And the big sort of things that were very sort of heavy-handed, the big projects, the big serious projects, did far less, in my opinion, to re-energize and revitalize downtown than 1,000 tiny projects did.
But the symbolic value is there?
I think in that it draws attention. I think in that it makes a nice postcard, and it's a great building. It's a beautiful building. It doesn't necessarily relate to the city around it much. I don't feel like I am drawn into it really. And I mean, the times that I've been, I've gone up to the escalator in the center of it, and so it's a very insular sort of thing. But I mean, it goes back to the music center. Our 1960s New Formalist Music Center is beautiful and wonderful, but it also feels like an island, right. And it feels like you are on the island and you don't want to have contact with anybody that's off the island. Whereas if you walk down, Spring Street or Main Street in the sort of revitalized part of our historic downtown, you can go into any shop, you can wander in any place, you feel more, whether you're a homeless person or whether you're the mayor or something, you are just as welcome to go in and out of these neighborhoods as opposed to these sort of fortresses that feel much less welcoming.
That thought of islands and fortresses, I mean, so many high-profile places feel that way in Los Angeles, whether it is the music center or the concert hall or 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica. It's a street, but it still feels like you're in a defined area that you shouldn't go outside of, or that it doesn't want you to, or thinks you don't need to. Even for places I like in Los Angeles, there is the feeling of being on an island. Is that fixable, or should we be happy with island hopping?
Well, I mean, it feels really good when you're on the island, or when you're on the right side of the velvet rope or something. You feel like you're special, and you feel like people care about you, and you feel like you're in the, you're in the place you should be. But the minute you're on the wrong side of the rope, you suddenly appreciate, the differences. The secret is sort of knowing how to island hop, because they're going to be here, and they're probably not going to be, it's probably not something that's going to change. And I think that there's going to be certainly architecture and land use issues that keep people from seeing everything they should, and experiencing it fully. But you know what you're doing, you can get into any place.
All that said, I've never heard you discuss this or read you discuss this, but where in Los Angeles do you choose to make your home?
Oh, I was in Silver Lake, and I liked it there a lot. And then the landlord gave me the boot because he sold the house at the height of the housing market. And I went to an estate sale at the same time, and I asked the fellow what was going to become of the house, and he said, "Well, you can rent it." And so I did, and I ended up in Altadena, which is a little bit out of the way, up against a mountain, a hillside like it is. It's very green, and it's very different. The first day I moved up there, I ran into a friend at the hardware store, and he was wearing a plaid shirt and smoking a cigarette and carrying an axe. And I thought, well, wow, where have I moved? This is so different.
Not a figure associated in the popular mind with Los Angeles.
No, and it's like that up there. It's quirky, and it's green, and it's different, and I like it a lot. But, I leave every morning and I come back into the city and I spend most of my time here.
Now, finally, I'll ask you right now, I mean, given all you know about the history of Los Angeles, everywhere you've been, all you've experienced, just in this moment, if I were to ask you what you want to experience next in Los Angeles, what is the next, your next frontier, be it historical, be it geographical, be it architectural, experiential in Los Angeles, what do you look toward now as sort of the next exploration for Chris Nichols?
I want to get lost.
Is that possible for you? Can you get lost ever anywhere? Can you get lost at this point? It's legitimate.
I miss it. I miss getting lost, and I really want to. And I think that like the southeast area, I still got kind of lost in the industrial.
Like a Bellflower?
Oh yeah, that's where I'd like to be right now. I'd like to be cruising Bellflower Boulevard, looking for stuff. I'd like to go down to Linwood, and Lakewood and those areas, because I don't know them very well, and I love nothing more than cruising an old boulevard and having some mystery pop out at me and figuring out what it is, or seeing some sign and being lured into some great place that I've never been to before.
It sounds like the most important questions that are asked of Chris are thus the ones that Chris asks Chris. What's things that are mysteries to you are the real mysteries here.
Oh, sure. I mean, I certainly never claim to know everything about anything. I mean, I have an expertise in a very, very tiny corner of a very arcane subject. I mean, I know a lot about Googie coffee shops, for one thing. But I mean, I know a little bit about a lot of things, and I think that there's certainly an army of experts that I consult regularly that are my real secret weapons. Having an expert in Hollywood history, and having an expert on maps, and having an expert on photographs, and having an expert in all these different fields that are willing to take my call and take the energy and effort it takes to solve these great mysteries is really how I figure it out. It doesn't come to me in a dream,
It takes work.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of really dedicated, amazing, collectors and librarians and experts in all their respective fields. I'm very lucky to have this great group of friends that help me figure this stuff out.
I've been speaking here in the mid-Wilshire neighborhood with Chris Nichols, associate editor at Los Angeles Magazine, Los Angeles preservationist, author of the Ask Chris column and blog, as well as the author of the book The Leisure Architecture of Wayne McAllister. Chris, thanks so much for taking the time today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on Movies, Paul Doyle, Umberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.